On a stretch of Saudi Arabian desert outside Riyadh in January 2020, an American rider named Ricky Brabec crossed a finish line and did something that no one, anywhere in the world of motorcycle racing, had managed to do in 18 years. He beat KTM. Not just a single KTM rider, not just a single factory team, but the entire orange machine that had turned the Dakar Rally motorcycle category into the most one-sided contest in the history of motorsport. For 18 consecutive editions of the toughest race on the planet, across 2 continents and 3 decades of desert, every single winning bike had rolled off the same production line in Mattighofen, Austria. And then, in a matter of minutes, it was over. To understand what actually died in that Saudi desert in 2020, you have to rewind almost 30 years to a freezing Austrian winter with none of the glamour of desert racing anywhere in sight. In December 1991, KTM was not a rally powerhouse. It was a company in the process of collapsing. Decades of motorcycle manufacturing had run headlong into a botched attempt to diversify into bicycles and radiators, and the core business bled out its cash reserves until there was nothing left. KTM Motorfahrzeugbau AG filed for bankruptcy with debts north of 70 million euros. Hundreds of workers lost their jobs, and by any reasonable measure, the story of KTM as a motorcycle brand should have ended right there in the snow with the factory gates closed. It didn't end because of one man's stubbornness. Heinz Kinnegadner, an Austrian who had become his country's first-ever motocross world champion in 1984 and 1985, refused to let the brand die with the company. He convinced a restructuring specialist named Stefan Pierer, a man with no particular emotional attachment to motorcycles, that KTM's name still meant something and was worth saving. Pierer took the gamble, relaunched the company on the 8th of January 1992 with barely 160 employees left on the payroll, and quietly made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of the brand. Motorsport, and specifically the most brutal motorsport event on Earth, would be the proving ground that rebuilt KTM's reputation from nothing. That decision was not obvious, and it was not safe. A newly reborn company with a skeleton workforce and a fraction of its old capital had no business throwing money at the Dakar Rally, an event that could swallow an entire marketing budget and return nothing but broken bikes and bad headlines if it went wrong. Established giants like Honda, Yamaha, and BMW had already built their reputations in Africa's deserts during the original Paris-Dakar years, and none of them were bankrupt companies gambling their survival on a race. But Kinnegadner's logic was brutally simple. Nothing proves a motorcycle's durability like 2 weeks of sand, rock, and heat with no room for excuses, and nothing rebuilds a broken brand faster than winning the race that breaks everyone else. The first payoff came in 2001, when Italian rider Fabrizio Meoni carried a KTM across the finish line in first place overall, the company's first Dakar victory. It should have been the beginning of a simple, uninterrupted success story. It wasn't. Behind that victory sat a quieter, more dangerous truth that the marketing photographs never showed. The same desert that built KTM's reputation was also killing the very riders responsible for it, and within a few years, that cost would come due in a way that nearly ended the entire program before it had properly begun. Meoni won again in 2002, and by the middle of the decade, KTM had assembled a factory roster that looked unbeatable on paper. Meoni himself, French rider Cyril Despres, Spaniard Marc Coma, and 3-time Dakar champion Richard Sanct, a Frenchman who had already won the race in 1999, 2000, and 2003. On the 29th of September 2004, during the Rallye de Pharaon in Egypt, Sanct crashed for a second time after already appearing to recover from an earlier fall, and this time he did not get back up. He was 34 years old. KTM withdrew every factory rider from the remainder of that race out of respect, and the entire team was left to process the death of one of its biggest stars less than 4 months before the next Dakar. Then, on the 11th of January 2005, on stage 11 of that year's Dakar Rally, running in second place overall, Fabrizio Meoni crashed shortly after a routine fuel stop on a fast, dangerous section of track near the town of Kiffa in Mauritania. A rival rider found him minutes later and radioed for a helicopter. By the time medical crews reached him, his heart had already stopped, and 45 minutes of resuscitation attempts could not bring him back. He was 47, a 2-time Dakar champion, and he had reportedly told teammates that this would be his final Dakar before retiring from competition altogether. 2 of KTM's biggest stars were now dead within 4 months of each other, and the company's own management publicly urged every factory rider left on the course to abandon the race entirely. They didn't abandon it. The decision on whether to continue was left deliberately to the individual riders and their families rather than dictated from Austria, and Cyril Despres chose to keep going. 5 days later, he crossed the finish line at Lac Rose in Dakar in first place, delivering KTM's 5th consecutive overall victory in a race that had just killed 2 of his closest friends and teammates. It is impossible to separate that win from what preceded it. It was not just a marketing triumph anymore. It was proof, inside the team itself, that the program Kinnegadner had built out of a bankrupt factory was now bigger than any single rider, however painful that truth was to accept in the days after Meoni's funeral. What actually made these motorcycles capable of surviving, and for 2 riders, tragically not surviving, 2 weeks of unsupported desert racing was a piece of engineering most casual fans never think about. The LC8 engine, essentially 2 of KTM's existing LC4 single-cylinder engines fused onto a common crankcase to create a compact V-twin, producing roughly 100 horsepower. That figure sounds modest next to a modern superbike, but the number that actually mattered in the Sahara was torque delivered low in the rev range, because a rally bike spends most of its life crawling through soft sand and rock fields at moderate speed, not screaming down a straight where raw peak power would matter far more than it does across 1,000 kilometers of dunes. The frame dimensions on the earliest version of that bike were reportedly specified in part by Meoni himself, meaning the machine that eventually helped end his life was partly engineered according to his own instincts about what a Dakar bike needed to survive. Everything about the rest of the package followed the same unglamorous logic. Oversized fuel tanks bolted around the frame to stretch range across stages with no refueling for hundreds of kilometers, long travel suspension tuned to absorb landings off dune crests without folding the front wheel, and a navigation tower bolted above the headlight to hold the paper roadbook riders had to read one-handed at speed, since GPS coordinates alone were deliberately restricted to keep the event a genuine test of route finding, rather than a straight sprint to a marked target. For most of the 2000s, KTM's dominance grew so total that it became a genuine problem for the sport itself. Marc Coma and Cyril Despres traded victories back and forth between them almost every year through the middle of the decade, and the 2 men became the sport's defining rivalry precisely because beating each other was the closest thing left to real competition. Beating a rider from another brand had stopped being a realistic goal for almost anyone on the entry list. Between them, the 2 riders would eventually collect 10 podium finishes apiece across their careers, an extraordinary concentration of success for a race that fields well over 100 motorcycles every year. That concentration came at a cost to the sport's business. Manufacturers that had once run serious factory rally programs, Yamaha and BMW among them, quietly scaled back their ambitions once it became clear that outspending KTM's accumulated years of chassis and engine development was no longer a realistic short-term strategy. Race organizers watched ticket sales and television interest tied to genuine unpredictability, start to erode as a result, because a race where the outcome felt preordained before the first stage even started was, commercially, a far weaker product than a genuine fight between rival factories. By the end of the decade, the people who ran the Dakar Rally decided they needed to do something about a problem that had a very specific, single cause: the size of KTM's engine. In 2009, the organizers announced a coming change that KTM's rivals had been quietly lobbying for. Starting in 2011, every elite rider in the motorcycle category would be restricted to a single engine no larger than 450 cubic centimeters, effectively banning the big V-twins that had carried KTM to a decade of victories. It was, in practical terms, a rule written to specifically neutralize the reigning champion, something almost unheard of in a sport that usually only changes regulations after a crisis, not to deliberately punish a winner. Rival manufacturers who had given up on outracing KTM's engine now had a real reason to believe the fight could restart from something closer to zero. It didn't work the way anyone outside KTM's expected. The company's engineers took the smaller single-cylinder engine already used in its enduro bikes, stripped it down, and rebuilt it specifically for rally use, launching the KTM 450 Rally in 2011 as, in its first year, essentially a slightly older 690 Rally chassis wearing the new mandated engine. Marc Coma won the very first Dakar run under the new rule on that bike. The rule that was supposed to hand the race to Honda, Yamaha, or BMW instead simply confirmed that KTM's advantage had never really been about raw displacement in the first place. It was about the accumulated years of chassis geometry, suspension tuning, fuel tank placement for desert range, and rider development that no single regulation change could erase overnight. By 2014, KTM had completely redesigned the 450 Rally into a lighter, slimmer, better handling machine built from the ground up for the new engine rule rather than adapted to it. And the streak that had started with Meoni in 2001 simply kept extending through name after name. Coma again, Despres again. Then a new generation led by Australian Toby Price, who became the first Australian ever to win Dakar in 2016, Austrian Matthias Wagner in 2018, and Price again in 2019, riding to victory despite competing with a broken wrist sustained days before the start. By the time the 2019 race finished, KTM had won 18 consecutive editions of the event, a run so long that an entire generation of Dakar fans had grown up never once seeing another brand's motorcycle cross the finish line first. Honda had not given up quietly during those 18 years. The Japanese manufacturer, which had actually won Dakar 5 times during the original African era of the race in the 1980s before walking away from the sport entirely, made the decision in 2013 to return to Rally Raid with a purpose-built factory team, betting that a sustained, well-funded, multi-year engineering effort could eventually outdevelop a rival with an 18-year head start. That bet cost Honda years of frustrating near misses. American rider Ricky Brabec had already been leading the 2018 and 2019 editions of the race outright before mechanical failures forced him to retire both times within sight of the finish, watching KTM riders inherit the lead and extend the streak he had come agonizingly close to breaking twice in a row. The 2020 Dakar Rally, the first ever held in Saudi Arabia after the race relocated out of South America, became the moment everything Honda had spent 7 years building finally converged. Brabec took the overall lead after Stage 3 and simply refused to give it back, riding a calculated, conservative race that prioritized consistency over stage wins, exactly the strategy that had failed him through mechanical bad luck in each of the 2 previous years. When he crossed the finish line near Qiddiya, he became the first American ever to win the Dakar Rally outright, and Honda claimed its first Dakar victory in 31 years. KTM's Toby Price finished third. The 18-year streak that had started with Fabrizio Meoni survived the deaths of two of the team's biggest stars and outlasted a rule change explicitly written to end it, was finally, genuinely over. What that streak actually represented went far beyond a trophy case. It was proof of a specific, repeatable engineering philosophy, that a rally bike wins not through peak horsepower, but through the unglamorous accumulation of small, reliability-focused decisions made and refined over decades, in a discipline where a single mechanical failure 200 kilometers from the nearest checkpoint can end a career in an afternoon. It was also proof that a company built back from an actual bankruptcy by one stubborn former world champion could outfund and outdevelop manufacturers many times its size for the better part of 2 decades, simply by treating one specific race as more important to its identity than any other manufacturer was willing to. The story didn't end with Brabec's win either. KTM returned to the top of the podium again in 2023 with Kevin Benavides, and again with Daniel Sanders in 2025, proving the 18-year run had not been some unrepeatable fluke of a single generation of riders, but a genuine institutional advantage that survived the loss of its biggest stars, survived a regulation designed to kill it, and survived losing the streak itself without losing the program's ability to win. Somewhere in a museum in Mattighofen today sits the bike Fabrizio Meoni helped design the dimensions for, a machine built by a company that, on paper, in the winter of 1991, should never have existed long enough to build anything at all. So when you watch that finish line footage from Saudi Arabia in 2020, the real story isn't really about Ricky Brabec, however deserved his victory was after 2 years of heartbreak. It's about everything that had to happen before that moment even became possible. A bankrupt factory in the Austrian snow, a stubborn motocross champion who refused to let a name die, 2 young riders who never came home from the desert, a rule specifically written to end a dynasty that quietly refused to end anyway, and 18 years in which the hardest race on the planet somehow, improbably, never had a different winner. The streak broke in 2020. The reason it lasted 18 years in the first place is the actual legend. And that is why the KTM 450 Rally became far more than just another motorcycle. It became a symbol of resilience, engineering excellence, and the relentless pursuit of victory in the toughest race on Earth. Behind every legendary machine lies a story of bold decisions, incredible innovation, and people willing to risk everything to push the limits of what seemed possible. If you enjoyed discovering the real story behind this remarkable machine, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Amazing Machines, and join us for more incredible documentaries revealing the history, engineering, and legends behind the world's most extraordinary vehicles.